Good evening, I'm Claudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight. A new batch of military aid for Ukraine was announced. The CDU's candidate for the office of the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz promised Taurus missiles, while the EU greenlighted a hefty sum of over 4 billion euros to support the embattled country. But that's not all. A new contact group for supporting Ukraine is set to meet in December. We'll come to that in just a minute, but first let's take a look at the latest headlines. The downfall of Syria's Assad regime shames Russia on the world stage. Georgia reportedly freezes not only EU but also NATO aspirations. And nominations for the Golden Globes announced. A meeting of a new contact group for strengthening Ukraine is expected later in December. Composed of Kyiv's key partners, including Poland, the group stems from a proposal by German opposition leader Friedrich Merz, who was in Kyiv on Monday. This comes as a wide stream of aid is opening for Ukraine. The EU on Monday greenlighted more than 4 billion euro in funds, while Merz has vowed to bolster Ukraine if he's elected chancellor early next year. Among the weapons he wants to deliver to Ukraine are long-range missiles. Ovidiusz Nicheja reports.
Friedrich Merz wants to ramp up support for Kyiv. He believes Berlin can do much more for Ukraine.
We are forcing your country to fight with one hand tied behind your back. This is not our position.
In contrast to Olaf Scholz, Merz is in favor of delivering Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine and allowing Kyiv to use them to strike military targets in Russia. Merz also wants to create a new contact group for Ukraine, which includes Germany, France, Poland and the United Kingdom. The group may also include Denmark, representing the Nordic countries. And according to opinion polls, Friedrich Merz is the clear frontrunner to become Germany's next chancellor, well ahead of Olaf Scholz, whose Social Democratic Party has seen its support decline since the 2021 elections. Merz's visit to Kyiv comes just days after Chancellor Scholz was there.
The elections are a chance for Ukraine, and the likely victory of the Christian Democratic Union and their candidate for the chancellery, Friedrich Merz, is to the advantage of Ukraine, because the Christian Democrats have been, on the whole, more resolute and more norm-driven than the Social Democrats.
President Zelensky talked with the chancellor candidate about security guarantees.
Emmanuel Macron proposed that troops from one country or another could be present on certain Ukrainian territories, which would guarantee our security while Ukraine is not in NATO. But we need to have a clear understanding of when exactly Ukraine will join the European Union and when Ukraine will be in NATO.
EU countries have agreed to send additional 4.1 billion euro to Ukraine to cover state expenses.
In particular now during the winter, with the ongoing targeting of energy grid and other civilian objects, they are not giving up, and we are going to stand by them.
The US president-elect has said that his country's membership in NATO is dependent on the Europeans' defense spending.
If they're paying their bills, and if I think they're treating us fairly, the answer is absolutely, I'd stay with NATO.
But if not, you would consider the possibility of
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
We can show President Trump both arms spending, the highest among NATO countries, and investment in joint economic and defense activities at the highest level.
The Russian president has decorated veterans and widows of soldiers killed in Ukraine with the Heroes of Russia Gold Star medals.
Putin should think it's time to make peace because he's lost. When you lose 700,000 people, it's time. It's not going to end until there's a peace.
And Ukraine's attacks on Russian troops are not withering. The Ukrainian Security Service has shared video of Kyiv's drones called Sea Babies at work. The drones were reportedly effective in damaging ships and aircraft.
The dramatic collapse of Bashar al-Assad's brutal regime in Syria has been welcomed by many world leaders. Commentators say the Islamist rebel uprising also represents a brutal shaming blow to Russia, which had backed his government. They warn that Russia's failure to support Assad should be a lesson to countries relying on Moscow's mercenaries in Africa.
Syrians woke up on Monday to their first day without Assad rule in more than half a century. This video claims to show freed prisoners running through the capital's streets, celebrating the Assad dynasty's downfall.
We've been waiting for this day for 50 years. All the people were silenced and could not speak out because of this tyranny. Today we thank and ask God to reward everyone who contributed to this day, the day of liberation.
The 10-day lightning advance, led by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham Islamist group, known as HTS, encountered little resistance from Assad's backers, Russia and Iran. Analysts say the reversal of fortunes is humiliating for Moscow.
Definitely the situation is not in Russia's favor. Their military bases in Hmeim and Tartus are in danger.
Reports emerged last week that Russia's navy had fled the Mediterranean port of Tartus as the rebels advanced. The Khamenei air base at Lataki is a vital air supply link for the Kremlin's operations in Africa.
It seems that this loss of bases and air and naval bases in Syria, if it happens, will very seriously hinder these Russian interferences in the politics of African countries. In this sense, it could be an additional positive effect of the fall of the bloody regime.
The Russian news agency TASS reports that the rebels have guaranteed the security of Russia's military bases. Russian media report that Assad, who succeeded his father in 2000, has been granted asylum by the Kremlin. Adding to Putin's humiliation, it has emerged that the rebel leader, Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, may use Moscow's bases as a bargaining chip.
So there is a chance that Giuliani, for example, will trade the Russian presence in Syria for international recognition.
Analysts say the Kremlin's lack of support for Assad should be a warning to African countries that they cannot rely on Russia.
But the main lesson really is for the West African client states that are new to Russia, that are newly within the Russian sphere of influence, that actually Russia probably has neither the capacity nor has it really the will to defend its client states in difficult circumstances.
As crowds continued to celebrate, Britain said it could remove HTS from its list of banned terror groups. The race to gain influence in the liberated country has now begun.
The freezing of Georgia's Western aspirations is reportedly not limited to the European Union, but also to NATO, following the recent accusations of election fraud laid against the government in Tbilisi. Several former diplomats told TVP World that Georgia's progress towards joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has been virtually put on hold. NATO could also soon be suspending its partnership program with the South Caucasus nation. Kazimierz Wysiak has this report.
Joint exercises, intelligence sharing,
systematic observation,
and even entire operations run together. Georgia has been a close partner of NATO since 1994, but now all of that could be put on hold. The government of the Georgian Dream Party, after securing another term in contested elections this fall, froze EU accession talks until 2028, and that certainly hasn't been to NATO's liking.
The International Election Observation Mission noted the uneven playing field in which these elections were held, which undermines public trust in the outcome. Reports of election-related violations should be fully investigated.
In 2006, the Georgian parliament voted unanimously for a bill calling for the integration of Georgia into NATO. 2 years later, the organization promised eventual membership for the South Caucasus country. But at least several member states are now getting cold feet, according to a Georgian former civil servant with deep knowledge on NATO-Georgia cooperation. For security reasons, we couldn't reveal their identity.
It is fair to say that Georgia's NATO integration and membership process has been effectively frozen. It's obvious not only when we look at communication from NATO officials, but also documentation.
NATO's biggest military contributor, the United States, has already suspended its strategic cooperation with Georgia. The Noble Partner exercises, which were supposed to take place in the summer, have been postponed indefinitely. According to one former NATO diplomat, the entire organization could soon suspend its partnership program with Tbilisi.
Yes, everything is possible. There is no obligation on the part of NATO to maintain partnership with with the authorities, with the government, which clearly is violating a whole range of principles on which both NATO and the partnership is based.
Thousands of people are protesting daily in the Georgian capital, often met with brutal crackdowns by the police and special services. On Monday, the United Kingdom suspended all of its cooperation with Tbilisi due to the violence against the demonstrators and journalists.
In light of ongoing events, the UK will immediately suspend all program support to the Georgian government, restrict defense cooperation, and limit engagement with the Georgian Dream government until there's a halt to this move away from the European democratic norms and freedoms.
The Georgian government is only adding fuel to the fire with its increasingly anti-West rhetoric. Political commentators from Georgia point out recent comparisons to Ukraine, a scare tactic by the ruling party.
The proxies of the Georgian government are actively disseminating the narrative that the country's Euro-Atlantic aspiration might lead to the conflict with the Russian Federation. And we talk about the Georgian society, which is traumatized because of 3 wars over the past 30 years.
Russian forces have occupied 2 Georgian territories of South Ossetia and Abkhazia since 2008. Being Russia's direct neighbor in the south, the country has been an important partner for the NATO alliance. The future of this cooperation now looks to be very uncertain.
Romanian police have detained a former mercenary, Horatiu Potra, believed to have ties with the far-right presidential candidate Călin Georgescu. Potra had been under police surveillance since his name appeared in the recently declassified documents of the National Security Council. He was detained alongside 19 others on their way to Bucharest on suspicion of plotting unrest. Sonia Agatabișcan has more.
A search of the vehicle where Horatiu Potra was found uncovered a 50mm pistol and bladed weapons. A total of 68 pyrotechnical objects and an equivalent of over 20,000 euro in cash were discovered in the 4 vehicles searched by the police.
Police officers opened 4 prosecution files, 2 of them for not respecting the norms of detaining explosive materials and 2 others for driving under the influence of drugs.
Potra owns a private security company. He previously worked as a mercenary in the Congo and is a former member of the French Foreign Legion. While authorities are yet to investigate the links between Potra and presidential candidate Călin Georgescu, the media claim there are ties between the two.
There are strong evidence that at least some of the bodyguards of Mr. Georgescu worked with Mr. Potra previous to this.
This is not Georgescu's only trouble with the authorities. On Saturday, prosecutors raided the home of Bogdan Peșchir, believed to be Georgescu's key financial backer. The Romanian presidential candidate claimed that his election campaign cost nothing, but declassified files suggest that Peșchir invested 1 million euro in Georgescu's campaign.
Since everyone was promoting intensely on TikTok, being paid, of course, his message, his videos, his whatever he had to say, it's clear that a lot of money were spent in this campaign, and all the wires, at least for the moment, are leading towards Bogdan Peșchir. He has a background in IT, he's a programmer himself.
Peșchir's TikTok accounts were sponsoring both pro-Georgescu and pro-Russian content.
The authorities found yesterday 7 million euros in Bitcoin on his account. Because on TikTok, you can have a stream live, and people can throw money at you, just like they throw flowers. And this guy was throwing hundreds of thousands of euros to people supporting and pumping up this guy.
The authorities are investigating whether Peșchir's funds were linked to criminal activities, including money laundering. A critic of both EU and NATO, Georgescu unexpectedly topped the polls in the first round of the presidential elections. But on Friday, the Constitutional Tribunal decided to annul the results due to widespread allegations of Russian interference.
Today's decision by the Constitutional Court represents more than a legal controversy. It is practically a formalized state coup.
The first round of presidential elections is expected to take place in March 2025, and it is unclear whether Georgescu will be allowed to run.
On Monday, a Warsaw court issued a temporary arrest for Marcin Romanowski, a member of parliament from the opposition Law and Justice Party. The former deputy justice minister stands accused of abuse of power in connection with handing out government grants.
Marcin Romanowski is set to spend 3 months in pretrial detention as the court case against him proceeds. The district court made the decision behind closed doors, while the accused himself was absent due to health reasons.
The MP will not be present today because he underwent a somewhat complex medical operation with complications.
In the court's opinion, Romanowski may tamper with the case if allowed to remain free.
The court has ruled in accordance with the prosecution's argument that the reason for pretrial detention is the risk of tampering, that the accused will unlawfully hamper the case.
Romanowski was charged on 11 counts, including belonging to an organized crime group and abuse of power. All charges are connected to the case of the Justice Fund, used by the Justice Ministry to grant funding for NGO projects. The prosecution claims that the process of deciding which projects to fund was rigged. The defense plans to appeal the ruling.
I honestly don't understand this decision, particularly when it comes to the court's argument that the tampering is a risk, since no other person connected with my client has been put in the pretrial detention. Therefore, I will appeal this deeply unjust decision.
Romanowski was stripped of his parliamentary immunity by the Polish parliament and then arrested. He was later released after a different court ruled that he held a second immunity, that of a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. This immunity was subsequently stripped from him as well. On Monday, the court dismissed one of the charges, arguing that the prosecution had modified it after receiving the permission from the Polish parliament to prosecute Romanowski.
The court has dismissed one of the charges, pointing out that the prosecution did not have the Polish parliament's nor the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe's permission to conduct prosecutions on this charge.
Romanowski, as well as other members of his party, dismissed the case against him as politically motivated.
The prestigious Golden Globes nominations are here. Emilia Perez swept the floor with 10 nominations, and awards may also be in store for Hollywood's 90s heartthrob Hugh Grant.
The nominees for the Best Television Limited Series, Anthology Series, or Motion Picture Made for Television are Baby Reindeer, Netflix; Disclaimer, Apple TV+; Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, Netflix; The Penguin, HBO Max; Ripley, Netflix; and The True Detective Night Country, HBO Max.
Emilia Perez, starring actor and singer-songwriter Selena Gomez, dominated the award show, securing a total of 10 nominations, including nods for Best Comedy or Musical and Best Director. Bradley Cooper's post-war drama The Brutalist, starring Adrian Brody as a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who becomes an architect in the US, followed with 7 nominations. Hugh Grant is also in contention for his leading role in the horror film Heretic. This puts Grant up for his first win in over 3 decades since he was named Best Actor for 4 Weddings and a Funeral. The committee made a nod to Polish cinematography too. This included A Real Pain by Jesse Eisenberg, which follows the story of 2 cousins who explore their Polish roots in a heartfelt story to explore the family's history in an attempt to rebuild lost and often complex relationships.
I really did have an unusual introduction to Poland. My introduction to Poland was through my aunt, Doris. She is kind of a character in this movie. The characters are constantly talking about their grandma Dory. It's based on my aunt Doris, who was born and raised in Krasnostaw.
As is tradition, the ceremony will be held in January next year, with Hollywood hosting a star-struck red carpet once again.
In a December 8th interview on NBC's Meet the Press, United States President-elect Donald Trump elaborated on his plans for changes he will introduce after he's sworn into office. As the next U.S. president's vision for the future is slowly beginning to crystallize, Brussels is holding its breath in anticipation. U.S. trade policies will usher in a period of great instability in global economic governance and will have important implications for the EU. Joining me now to discuss potential impact of the recent statements by President-elect Donald Trump on EU economy is Professor Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the London School of Economics. Good evening and welcome to the program.
Good evening. Welcome to you.
So as we're looking at the interview on the 8th of December, there is a quote that particularly stood out for me. And I say, they take advantage of us on trade, meaning the European nations, absolutely terrible. They don't take our cars, they don't take our food product, they don't take anything. It's a disgrace. And on top of that, we defend them. Those were the words of President-elect Donald Trump during his interview. Based on what Mr. Trump said in that quote, but also in the rest of the interview, what consequences do you think this is going to have for Europe?
Well, if he goes ahead with his threat to impose tariffs on Europe, it's going to make it more difficult for European companies to sell into one of its most significant markets, namely the United States. The whole of the world is holding its breath to see what Trump actually does, as opposed to what he says he'll do. They're not always the same thing. But if heavy tariffs are imposed, the Europeans are going to have to look in one of two directions. One is whether they can internalize demand, have retaliatory tariffs, which mean that instead of buying from the rest of the world, and particularly from the United States, we buy as Europeans from each other. It means imposing trade barriers. And economic theory lasting 200 years has told us this is against the interest ultimately of countries, but Trump seems to believe it's the correct approach. So that's one direction. The second is his connection with defense. Countries like Poland, which spend relatively more on defense, may think they're in with a better chance than those like Germany, which have always lagged behind in the way in which they approach defense spending, relying much more on the US security guarantee. And it's clear that Trump is going to revisit what he did in his first term in office, namely to put huge pressure on European countries to raise the amount of spending on defense in order to alleviate the burden on the US. So those two things are going to come together with significant economic impacts.
Mm-hmm. Going back to your first point that you made, do you think that the EU could actually engage in a full-scale tariff war with the US? Is it a possibility?
Well, there's a third player in this as well, which is China. And it's clear that Trump is angling most to make it more difficult for China. So there are two possibilities for the EU externally. One is to say, right, well, if we are being excluded and the Chinese are being excluded from the American market, at least in relative terms, isn't there some scope for us to work together, that's Europe and China, to try to open markets in a way which benefits both of us? That's one solution. If the EU engages in a trade war with the US, it's hard to tell who will win and who will lose. Certainly Germany, a major exporter of electric vehicles in the past, is struggling to meet Chinese competition. And if it's also excluded from US markets, you will see a core country in Europe, which has links to other European countries, struggling. And that's going to be bad news overall for Europe. So Europe can engage in a trade war, but the simple message is that there are no winners in trade wars.
Mm-hmm. But do you think there's also a real running risk of EU actually being squeezed in between two economic heavyweight powers, such as Washington and Beijing?
Well, I think there's an opportunity for the EU to work with China. China doesn't want to be closed because it's a major manufacturing exporter. It imports services and certain high value-added manufacturers. So there is scope for a separate kind of deal to be done by the EU and not just China, but other parts of East Asia as a way of offsetting what might be coming down the road from the Americans if Trump fulfills his threats.
But there seems to also be a different solution. For example, we heard from Ursula von der Leyen. She suggested a possible steps to win over the incoming President Donald Trump. For example, increasing the purchases of U.S. LNG gas. Do you think this is something that would be enough to be able to attract President-elect's attention and have him remain and have Europe remain on his good side?
Well, I wish I could give you a categorical answer, but I don't think I or anybody else can give you a clear-cut answer because Trump is a deal maker by nature. You could say, yes, he's going to engage in more drilling, therefore be producing more natural gas, which you may want to liquefy and sell to Europe. And if that opportunity arises, he may say, right, you're helping me in both directions, both in my production of gas and in accepting the exports. So I'll be a bit more lenient with you on other forms of trade between us. But Trump is unpredictable, and his very unpredictability is the only thing you can predict about him.
Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of time when the 47th President of the United States is going to be sworn into office. We're actually weeks away. I was wondering, once this happens, what are the greatest challenges that the EU is going to face while working with the new U.S. administration? Which areas are going to be the areas where there has to be the most emphasis on? Is it trade? Is it big tech? In terms of economy, what are the challenges?
Well, Europe knows that it's lagging behind in big tech. If you look through the lists of top tech companies, very few are European. They come in number 20 in a global list, SAP in Germany, and further down before you get to the next ones. So for Europe, there's a big problem there about trying to revitalize its tech sector. And recently there was something produced in Brussels called the Draghi Report, which is trying to think through how can Europe become a bit more in the game in big tech.
And what is your solution to this? How do you think that Europe should actually respond?
Well, there isn't an easy solution. The Draghi Report suggested a massive competitiveness fund aimed at promoting European activity in big tech and other industries of the future. Europe has a certain advantage in some of the science-based industries like biotech, but it's a long haul. I don't think Europe is going to transform itself very quickly. So Europe faces a difficult time in working out how to fund it, how to govern it, and how to ensure that it's not a form of industrial policy which sees politicians picking the winners rather than the market picking the winners, because politicians picking the winners very often fails to work.
One of the other big points of discussion, both in the US and in the European Union, is the big tech. And we heard from people close to Trump, such as entrepreneur Elon Musk. He criticized the EU regulatory policy considering the big tech before. We've heard that multiple times, especially when it comes to the multi-layer clampdown. What are we to expect here? What are going to be the steps between the US and the European Union?
Well, it's a power struggle in one respect, because the Americans like to dominate big tech and have done for quite some time. They don't want to encourage new European competitors to come into the market and disrupt them. So for the Europeans, the challenge is, can we take an approach to this which brings us some advantages? It could be in military equipment, it could be in biotech, it could be in other areas which we haven't really thought through enough yet, like artificial intelligence. So the opportunities are there, but Europeans need to work together to try to get round the obstacles that either Trump or Elon Musk are putting in their way.
So do you think that Mr. Trump is actually going to expect more rain when it comes to big tech? Is there common ground that you think that the US and Europe are going to find? Or I was wondering how much EU is actually willing to allow when it comes to the big tech?
Well, the EU has instinctively regulated first and worried about market share later. The US tends to be the opposite. It worries about market share, market innovation, and then thinks, how do we regulate? So there could be a change of stance by the EU to say, we need to take more risks. We need to finance some of the potential new big techs, which today are small techs, in ways which will enable them to grow in the future. Just think how rapidly some of the US big tech companies like NVIDIA have grown from next to nothing a decade ago to the dominant chip maker. You don't see that in Europe, and Europe needs a change of mentality to make that happen.
So very shortly, because our time unfortunately is coming to an end, what do you think should be the next steps by the European Union as of now, only weeks ahead of Mr. Trump being sworn into office?
Have a plan B on trade, some way of dealing with the tariff threat. Think medium to longer term about how to improve competitiveness in Europe, including the advancing of big tech.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the London School of Economics. Pleasure as always to have you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
And so this would be all the latest news for now here on World News Tonight, but please do stay tuned here on TVP World, as we will be back with more news and features in just a moment.